in the back and put this down here so y'all can see. Alright, so you got our occipital bone here. And when we're looking at this bone, we got a few parts we mentioned already here. The basilar part of your occipital bone. And remember, when we dorsum sellae of our sphenoid bone, you make the clivus, which is the slope that you see in the skull.
Is that just one structure, or is there like a joint?
Yeah, so when you do the translation for clivus, it literally means slope. So it is that whole thing. But you have to put those two parts together to get the whole thing. Yep, so the basilar part of your occipital bone and the dorsum sellae of the sphenoid bone.
And we form the clivus.
Clivus, yep. Dorsum sellae plus the basilar part gives you the whole slope of the clivus. Okay, other part we have on our occipital bone we need to know are the jugular processes. So those little corners. And next quarter, when you do this, if your x-ray isn't straight on A to P, you can use those as your alternate points of measure.
Can you repeat the name again?
Jugular process. Also on the internal aspect, we've got our internal occipital protuberance, and I went ahead and labeled this skull here to make it just a little bit easier, so you can see where I put the black dot. So it's just on the other side of your external occipital protuberance. And then running from that IOP down to foramen magnum is your internal occipital crest. And likewise, I put some markers in this whole skull here. Also, on the flip side of the external occipital crest. And then then the other things you had here on your occipital bone on the external aspect are your superior and inferior nuchal lines, or you can say nuchal ridges. A little less well defined here on this bone, but they are there. So all you people that have had or have tension headaches or migraine headaches, if you had anybody do any of this
Occipital
type,
base release?
yep, any of that stuff,
Wow.
they're running their fingers
So smart.
right up the external occipital crest, or all along the base of the skull to the nuchal lines, because that's where all those suboccipital muscles are attaching to, and people usually get trigger points along those. So you'll learn that later, 7th and 8th quarter. Or if you take my soft tissue class.
Shameless plug.
What's that?
Shameless plug.
Plus. Lean in. Okay, good on this occipital bone? Okay, so that's all you got there. Alright. While we have the sphenoid bone out here, I was making it exciting for you.
Dramatic. I like it. The camera loves it.
We look in our skull here, our sphenoid bone, sitting like that. Okay. Alright, so we've got our lesser wings. What were these guys?
Greater ones.
Greater wings. Good. How about these guys? Those were the pterodactyls, right? There you go, pterygoid plates, yeah. All right, and then our sella turcica is made up of our dorsum sellae, right, which we already talked about, helping to form the clivus. Okay, so dorsum sellae. Okay, the seat of the saddle is your hypophyseal fossa. And then the front of the saddle is your tuberculum sellae. In this model here, they did a little bit better job here of representing the tuberculum sellae. That's kind of more what it's supposed to look like. So you can see how it's a more distinct structure from the rest of the sphenoid bone. But remember, that's your little home for your pituitary glands. When we get out the cadaver here, I'll show you where the optic nerves head out. But if we just use the probes here, you can see the pathway of the optic nerve, and you can see how they crisscross right by that pituitary gland. And if you remember from class, we were talking about that bitemporal hemianopsia. That's why right there. Okay, so that's your sella turcica. And then the only other parts we had here on our sphenoid bone were the clinoids. We've got 2 anterior clinoids and 2 posterior clinoids. So our anterior clinoids are going to be on the tips of our lesser wings. And our posterior clinoids are going to be the tips of the dorsum sellae. Not really well defined here. They're supposed to be hanging off a little bit more like that. But remember that these 4 clinoids allow attachment for dura mater. And specifically, it's a little part of dura mater that forms the roof over your pituitary gland. And I'll be able to show you a little bit of those remnants on our cadaver.
Can we run through that again?
Sure. Okay, so you have lesser wings, greater wings, pterygoid plates, our sella turcica is made up of your tuberculum sellae, the hypophyseal and the dorsum sellae. And then our points of attachment for the dura mater are the anterior clinoids and the posterior clinoids. Okay. And just for a frame of reference, again, the bone's sitting in the skull like that. Okay. So you can see the little manta ray shape right here, and your sella turcica. Okay, good on this one?
Yeah.
Questions? All good? All right. Part 1, we'll see that. And this one's sitting in our skull. Like that. Only a little bit lower. So on the top here, we can see our crista galli. Also in here on our skull. Okay. We've got our cribriform plate. Pretty well defined here. I'll be able to show you that on our cadaver as well. You can actually see the little perforations for your olfactory bulbs. That's our cribriform plate. And then crista galli.
And olfactory bulbs.
Olfactory bulbs are going to lay right on top of the cribriform plate. Yeah. Okay. Now to find the perpendicular plate and the concha, easiest if you look on the posterior side first. Okay. Running right down the middle is the perpendicular plate. and you can trace it all the way anteriorly if you just rotate that bone all the way around. Okay, so it's running right down the midline, separating the bone in half. And remember this one here, your perpendicular plate, is going to combine with your vomer to give you the bony part of your nasal septum. And if you're looking here on this one, you can see where the vomer would sit. Back in there like that with the ethmoid on top. Okay, turbinates. Just look on either side here of your perpendicular plate. You got your superior nasal turbinate, and then the middle nasal turbinate, or you can say concha. Remember, the inferior one is its own separate bone. It's its own separate facial bone. Q? All right. I would say something else, but... Okay, good on that one. Alright, so remember you have two of these. Alright, one on each side. Alright, so we've got from the external side, you can see the mastoid process. Styloid process, external auditory or acoustic meatus, which is your ear canal, squamous part, and then if we rotate around to the inside and we look for this triangular or pyramidal shaped part, that's your petrous part. When you look inside the skull, you can see how the petrous part runs lateral to medial over to meet your dorsum ocelli. Okay? And then the zygomatic process too, if you want to remember that for lecture. Okay, so that's the temporal bone. All right, so we'll run through the rest of these here already. We did our inferior nasal concha or turbinate. And that one, remember, came off of right here. So you're on the medial side of the maxilla. We've got our lacrimal bone. And then the palatine bone. L for palatine. Okay. And then the maxilla itself. Others we got here, just to finish it up. You got your zygomatic bones, nasals, mandible, then you got temporal, parietals, one frontal bone.
He was in an accident.
Yeah, awful. Don't forget your glabella. Okay, so on this bone you can see those superciliary arches making up the orbit. Remember the glabella from lecture is that little depression right in the middle. Yeah, exactly. And then we already did occipital bone too.
Back here.
While we're here and recording here, we'll run through your sutures for lecture 2. So you got your frontal suture, or you could say coronal suture, sagittal suture, lambdoidal suture, and then squamosal suture. And if you remember that one, because that's the squamous part. Right? Craniometric points. Okay. You got your pterion. Okay, so where your sphenoid, temporal, parietal, and frontal come together. Asterion in the back. So you got temporal, parietal, and occipital coming together. You've got the lambda, where the parietals and occipital come together. You got the vertex, which is the highest point on the sagittal suture. And then the bregma, where your coronal and sagittal suture meet. Okay. Then we've got our nasian, where our nasal bones and the frontal bone meet. Inian, which is just another word for your external occipital protuberance. And then on your occipital bone, just 2 more. You've got, if you look at your foramen magnum here and imagine a clock face, 12 o'clock is going to be the Bayesian. And you can remember that because that's the basilar part, right? Bayesian, basilar part. And then 6 o'clock back here, that's going to be your opistheon. Cool?
Yep.
So,
Check. Okay, so in the calvaria, it's separated into 3 separate fossa or depressions. We get our anterior cranial fossa, our middle cranial fossa, and our posterior cranial fossa. The boundaries are the lesser wings of our sphenoid bone. So those will separate anterior from middle. The petrous ridge will form the boundary between the middle cranial fossa and the posterior cranial fossa. On our anterior side, we We want to be able to identify the piriform aperture, which will look like a black triangle on your x-ray. Piriform meaning pear-shaped, aperture meaning opening. Our nasal spine we can use for a craniometric point for the midline, and that is where our vomer and our maxilla come together.